Certain and Uncertain, Chapter 8, Coming Home. They had failed. The drones were beating at Gwen's shield. So many at a time it would break soon. Ethan readied his makeshift batons and Kevin raised his fists. Then a bright orange light flashed out from Victor Validus and spread to every one of the infected people as they all stilled. The chips exploded into more cascades of light.
"What's happening?"
Kevin asked, looking around as the light grew brighter, spilling in from the outside now too. Gwen shook her head and the three of them were forced to shield their eyes as the light grew brighter still. Alan was sure they were done for. Manny had gone off the deep end and Pierce along with him. They were attacking, eyes glowing yellow. Cooper was working on containing the chips swarming Bellwood with no luck so far. Helen couldn't find Max, Kevin, Gwen, or Jen. No one was answering comms. Everything was going to shit, and they had no help. Then light blossomed from Manny and Pierce, spilling out of their eyes and mouths. The chips burst into light too, the orange glow spreading over Bellwood, turning evening into bright day for a moment. Then Manny and Pierce collapsed and the light retreated.
"What happened?"
Pierce stumbled and Helen caught him. Manny rubbed his head with two of his hands. "Are you okay?" Helen asked, holding her brother carefully.
"Well, we were on patrol, and then there were these chips everywhere."
Helen hugged her brother. "It's okay. You're okay now." Alan helped Manny back to his feet.
"But how?"
Manny asked, sounding relieved but still frustrated.
"We'll find that out later. Let's get back to the rust bucket and clean up."
They helped each other limp off before the police could take care of the aftermath. Going back out a nasal passage was still nasty. Rolling across the dirty floor, Jen found herself transforming back to her usual self in a flash of green. She found herself full-sized with a desperate need to shower, sprawled out on the ground, surrounded by people who had no idea where they were or why they were there. Their confusion was music to Jen's ears, but Ethan's cry of "Dad!" excited and nervous in equal measure, had her hopping back to her feet. She pushed away through the crowd as they began to mill their way back outside. Ethan was helping Kevin pull his father from the machine he'd been hooked up to. Jen grinned as she made her way the rest of the way to them. Ethan caught her eye and beamed, tears of happiness slipping down his face. "Looks like everything worked out okay." She grinned as she held out a hand to help. Ethan took her hand and gripped on tight.
"You saved him."
Ethan looked over at Kevin, who took a firmer grip on his father. Ethan lunged forward, wrapping Jen in a hug so tight she thought he might just crack a rib. She grinned. "You might not want to hug me so tight. I flew through a lot of snot." Ethan laughed as Kevin made a face and Gwen made a disgusted noise. Ethan's hug did not let up, though. He hugged the same way. "Grandpa Max!" Ethan released her in that moment, and she took off, Gwen hot on her heels as they began to search for their grandfather.
"Don't take it personally,"
Kevin stated as Ethan stepped back to help with his father, who was limping but otherwise unhurt.
"Family always comes first for Tennysons."
He was grinning as he said it, though, in no way resentful of the attitude. He looked very much like he admired it, really. Ethan nodded, his hand tightening on his father's shoulder. Jen nearly jumped a foot in the air when Grandpa Max grabbed her shoulder. His whole expression went slack with horror as he spotted her still broken nose.
"Kiddo, why?"
She threw herself into his arms. He let out a breath and held on to his granddaughter. She was soon joined by her cousin, and the three of them stood holding each other for a few moments. They were joined shortly by Kevin, Ethan, and Victor. Max felt his heart twist with regret.
"Vic."
Victor shook his head.
"You did what you thought was right, Max. And I was wrong, and the world suffered for it. I am so sorry, my old friend."
Victor reached out and took Max's hand.
"Looks like the kids fixed both our mistakes."
Max nodded as they began to make their way towards the parking lot.
"You're right. They're a lot more capable than anyone gives them credit for."
He looked over his granddaughters.
"Jen, what would you say if I asked you to take over?"
Jen blinked and shook her head. What? Like run plumber operations on Earth? I couldn't do that. Max shook his head.
In a way, you already have. It could have been anyone with that watch. We're just lucky it found you.
Jen shook her head. No. I mean that, Grandpa Max. I can't ever take over the plumbers. Max paused and raised an eyebrow. Gwen and Kevin looked a bit curious about what she meant, too. If I was a plumber, a real plumber, bound by the rules and regulations they're bound by, we'd have lost this fight. I had to go AWOL to even get this mission on the move. I can't be an official plumber. Besides, I can't sit behind a desk, you know that. Kevin laughed, wrapping an arm around Gwen. Victor had found his feet. Max smiled.
You know, sometimes you open your mouth, and I have problems believing the words that come out. When did you get so wise, kiddo?
Jen laughed. And Gwen laughed with her. Kevin pulled a face. Jen shrugged, tossing an arm around Ethan. Oh, I have my moments of brilliance. The six of them laughed as the sun began to set in the distance. At least the world would be safe for another day. Chapter 9, Campfire Stories. When they reached the parking lot, the group split. Max and Victor would be taking Ed's truck back to the shop. The 4 teens would head back in Jen's car. There just wasn't enough room in either vehicle to do anything else. All around them, the residents of Barren Rock milled, families reuniting, and the general attitude seemed to be one of confusion but relief. No one seemed to remember what had happened, but everyone seemed to get the sense that something bad had been averted. The 4 teens slipped away from the crowd back up the ridge. Once they reached the car, Jen fished the key out of her pocket and tossed it to Kevin. I'm not 16 yet, remember? World's safe, I can no longer drive. Not until I actually get my permit or the next crisis hits. You know, whichever comes first. I'm gonna crash in the back seat. She waited for him to click off the locks before sliding into the back seat, followed closely by Ethan. Gwen sat in the passenger side and Kevin took his usual spot behind the wheel. They were maybe 10 minutes into the drive back to Bellwood when the beeping started. Jen rolled her eyes and fished her necklace out of her shirt. It had been a gift from her last boyfriend, Albrassic's Prince of Apollo 1. It looked like a miniature jeweled plumber's badge. In fact, it was an actual functional communicator, though only a few people had the call code for it. You've reached Gen 10. I'm exhausted from saving the world right now. Please leave your catastrophe after the beep. Beep. Ethan snorted at her. Gwen rolled her eyes. Oh, good! Someone's answering comms! The voice belonged to Helen Wheels, one of the Max Force. Yeah. Sorry for up and disappearing. We had a situation to handle. So did we! Pierce and Manny went crazy and started attacking us. There were these chips swarming everywhere, and no one knows what happened. Jen sat up from her slump in the back seat. Are the chips gone now? Her voice had returned to the serious business-like tone it had taken on when she'd explained her plan to beat the chips. Everyone in the car held their breath. Yes. A collective sigh passed through the car. Jen flopped back into the seat. But what happened? Long story, Helen. We'll explain everything when we get back. Hey, is the rust bucket still parked at Grandpa's fishing spot? Yes. Cool. We'll meet you there tonight and explain everything over food Grandpa Max didn't make. Helen laughed and agreed before ending the call. Jen nodded and dropped her necklace back under her shirt. She was out like a light in minutes. Kevin glanced into the back seat an hour or so later and held back a snort. He tapped Gwen on the knee and jerked a thumb towards the back seat. Gwen raised an eyebrow, but turned to look and had to slap her hands to her mouth to hold back her laughter. Both teens were sound asleep. Jen practically sprawled on top of Ethan. Her head was resting on his shoulder as she began to snore. He didn't seem to mind, though. He was dead to the world, one arm wrapped around Jen like she was his favorite teddy bear. Gwen pulled her phone out of her pocket and snapped a photo. I am never letting her live this down. Kevin chuckled and took Gwen's hand, squeezing gently.
Don't tease her too bad. She didn't tease us much about our first kiss.
Gwen blushed, but nodded slightly as he pressed a kiss to the back of her hand and refocused on the road. Their first kiss had been unconventional, to say the least. Gwen had laid one on him during the final battle with the Highbreed. Emotions had been running high, and she'd just watched the Highbreed rip her cousin's head off, only to have it grow back minutes later. If Jen hadn't been Swampfire at the time, she'd have died outright. Kevin had managed to pull Gwen back from her full unleashed Anodite form, and she'd kissed him full on the mouth. She leaned over and pecked him on the cheek as he drove back to Bellwood. Oh, would you just hold still? Gwen demanded as Jen squirmed. Kevin laughed as Gwen flicked through the pages of the book he was holding open for her. They had just finished explaining what had happened over the past few days, and Gwen had decided it was time to actually try and fix Jen's broken nose, not just staunch the bleeding. "You know my mom's a nurse, right?" Jen asked a bit nervously as she skimmed through the book Albraxix had given her as a gift for helping stop the incursion invasion of his planet. "You want to explain to your mom how your nose got broken?" Jen flinched at the question and held still. "You're gonna want to set that," Pierce offered from his spot at the grill. Ethan was currently arm wrestling with Alan while Cooper worked on Manny's prosthetic hand. The Tetraman was in the small cove with Helen, splashing around while Grandpa Max fiddled with one of the satellites on the roof of the rust bucket.
"He's not wrong."
Kevin nodded. He handed the book to Gwen and stepped in front of Jen. He placed both hands on either side of her still swollen and purple nose.
"This is gonna hurt."
That was all the warning she got before he snapped her nose back into place. She squealed in pain as fresh blood trickled from her nose. "Motherfucker!" she cried out and punched him in the gut. Kevin doubled over, partly from pain, partly from laughter. Ethan, who'd lost his match, picked up some napkins and held them out to her. She grimaced as she took them and dabbed away the blood. Gwen shoved the book back into Kevin's arms and flipped it back open.
At least he got it straight."
Pierce joked, and Jen stuck out her tongue at him. "Aha! Found it!" Gwen said triumphantly as she pointed to one of the entries in the book. "Grandpa, do you still have my box of ingredients?"
"Same place it always is, kiddo."
He called out from the roof, and Gwen disappeared into the rust bucket, quiet as a shadow. Victor Validus was asleep inside the RV, and the general consensus was that they should let him rest. Max was working on getting his plumber status restored and clearing his name with the Magistrata. Jen had offered to testify on his behalf, but Max wasn't sure it would be necessary. Ethan stepped over to the book Kevin was still holding.
"So, what is this?"
"Magic," Jen said matter-of-factly. Kevin made a face.
"It ain't magic."
Gwen and Jen's
grandma is an alien made of pure energy. Gwen got what she calls a spark from her. Alien powers, not magic."
Jen leaned back against the picnic table the teens had built. "I'm telling you, the things we've seen, magic is real, Kev." Gwen returned before he could argue further. She was holding a box and set it down on the table, pulling off the lid. Opening it revealed a collection of strange bottles with even stranger contents. Kevin frowned and handed the book to Ethan, careful to keep it open to the page Gwen had found.
"Hang on."
He rummaged in the trunk of Jen's car and pulled out a cooler. From that, he pulled a familiar green bottle. Jen glared. "You couldn't have pulled that out before you rebroke my nose?"
"Wouldn't have been as fun."
He pulled the cork out of the bottle and handed it to Jen as Gwen mixed foul-smelling ingredients. Ethan reeled slightly at the smell of alcohol from the bottle.
"That smells really strong. What is that?"
he asked. As Gwen consulted the book in his arms, Max appeared at Jen's elbow.
"Apoplexy and whiskey. Good year, too,"
he said, with a slightly judgmental look at Kevin, who shrugged.
"First busted it out when we thought you died. We never really got a chance to celebrate saving the world. Twice now."
Max laughed as Jen held out the bottle to him.
"I'm fine, kiddo. That stuff's not great for those without powers. Oh, and Alan, stick to water or soda until you get your heat under complete control."
The half-pyronite nodded. Jen took another swig from the bottle and handed it back to Kevin. "Finished," Gwen announced and began to dab the concoction onto her cousin's face. Ethan wrinkled his nose.
"You're lucky you can't smell anything right now."
Gwen shot Ethan a glare that shut him up immediately. Kevin laughed.
"He's not wrong, babe. Sorry, but that stuff smells nasty."
Gwen frowned as she kept smearing the stuff onto the purple bruises that covered a good part of Jen's face. "Don't open your mouth, Jen," Gwen commanded, and the brunette pressed her lips together tight. Gwen glanced at the page her book was still open to and nodded. "Geheler," Gwen chanted as her hands lit up pink. The glow spread to the concoction, and it hardened like clay in a kiln, falling off in chunks to reveal unblemished skin beneath. Gwen grinned and pulled a mirror out of her purse as her cousin scraped off the remainder of the goo. "Oh, they're right. That stuff smells nasty." Gwen elbowed her cousin and held up the mirror. "Works, though." Jen grinned. Gwen frowned and poked her cousin's newly healed nose. Not sure Kevin got it completely straight, though, she commented. Grandpa Max looked over his granddaughter with a slight grimace. Gwen was right. The difference was minute, but Jen's nose was just the slightest bit crooked. It was clear that it had been broken, though now it looked like it had happened years ago instead of earlier that day.
I could re-break it and try again,
Kevin offered as Helen pulled herself out of the water. Jen shrugged as Manny joined them. Nah, I think I'm good. I think it's kind of cute, Ethan said, grinning. Pierce shot him a searching look. He turned back to the burgers on the grill, a frown on his face. Jen didn't notice, though. She headed into the tent she was sharing with Gwen as Cooper gave Manny back his prosthetic hand. The team would all be camping out here tonight. Max and Victor would share the rest bucket. Kevin and Ethan had a tent to share. Everyone else had their own. The brunette came out a few minutes later, dressed in a bright green bikini. She ran up to the tallest rock overlooking the small bay. Geronimo! She cannonballed into the water, not noticing the looks of horror on the other teens' faces. Only Gwen and Kevin were unsurprised. Even Ethan looked shocked. Kevin frowned.
Would have thought she'd have told you about her scars,
he commented, glancing at the scar in question as the brunette bobbed back to the surface, a bright grin on her face. The alcohol had finally kicked in, staining her cheeks pink as she splashed water on her face and scrubbed her nose, as though she could still feel the residue of Gwen's spell.
When we were 13? No. She told me she had some, but never went into specifics.
Max nodded.
I'm not surprised. She doesn't like talking about it.
Who doesn't like talking about what? Jen asked, skipping back over to them, bare wet feet slapping on the rocks.
That badass scar,
Manny said, pointing to the scar that ran across Jen's side, starting just under her ribs and stretching down to her hip before flicking in at her belly button nearly an inch and a half.
There has to be a story behind that.
Jen's hands dropped to the scar. She went pale, even the alien liquor unable to keep color in her face. Pierce elbowed Manny, eliciting a yowl of pain from the Tetramand. Jen took a few deep, shaking breaths. Gwen stepped over to her cousin, hugging her, despite the fact that she was still soaked from her dip in the bay. You don't have to tell it if you don't want to. She rubbed her cousin's back in soothing circles. Jen nodded, relaxing slightly, but not entirely. No, it's okay. Her voice sounded bright as usual, but her hands were shaking as she picked up the bottle of whiskey and took another long draw on it. Pierce was glaring at Manny like he might let the boy's hamburger burn and force him to eat Grandpa Max's dung beetle stew instead. Ethan was watching Jen with concerned eyes. Jen sat down next to the readied but unlit fire pit. Alan flicked a hand at the logs, fire spilling from his fingers. Jen stared into the flames, their bright light reflecting in toxic green eyes. This happened back when I was 10. I'd had the Omnitrix for, a few weeks? Gwen shrugged. No idea. That summer felt like it went on forever and was never long enough. Max laughed a little and nodded.
It had been about 2 weeks, I think, he supplied.
Thanks, Grandpa. About 2 weeks. I'd been having nightmares about an alien I saw during a close encounter with a drone that tried to kill me. It would take too long to explain that she'd been a galvanic mechamorph inside the drone, and that, no, she didn't have that transformation anymore. For some reason, she'd only kept the transformation she'd used recently when she'd lost master control, and for some reason that didn't include the 24 races she and Azimuth had revived. Tall guy, she continued, 8'11", 7'10", Max said, setting down the pot of stew on the table. Yeah, tall, green, squid for a face. Alan laughed. No way. Jen raised her hands in surrender. Every word is true. Gwen and Grandpa Max will tell you if I lie. They nodded. See? Anyway, he'd been after the Omnitrix since he first heard about it. Long before I found it. He wanted an army loyal to him, or brainwashed, more likely. Each with their own Omnitrix. Jen covered the device with her free hand, a reflexive gesture. Her eyes were still fixed on the fire. She took another swig of the whiskey. Kevin eased it from her grip. She'd regret it in the morning if she drank any more. He kicked my ass across Keystone. That got looks of confusion. South Dakota, she clarified. We were on our way to Mount Rushmore. She paused again, as if something had just occurred to her. Pulling her gaze away from the fire, she glanced at Grandpa Max. You were going to take us to the plumber base there, weren't you? Max looked up from his stew. That was the plan.
Not originally. After you found the Omnitrix, things got a bit more complicated. I had planned to tell you about it when you were older, but then you started dreaming about Vilgax. I knew that if he'd survived, he was really coming after you, I had to do something. I just worked a little too slow. I didn't want to scare you any more than you already were.
Kevin frowned.
Wait, so you fought Vilgax too?
He asked as Pierce began to hand out burgers. Max nodded and sprung into the story of the last time he'd fought Vilgax during his plumber days. By the time he was done with his story, the burgers had vanished, replaced with marshmallows. Jen's hands had also stopped shaking as everyone's attention turned back to her. Like I said, he kicked my ass up and down Keystone, beat me outright, and managed to shut off the Omnitrix. He said the Omnitrix had already fused with my DNA, and he couldn't take it off there, so he took me back to his ship. She laughed, but there was almost no humor in it. Yep, actually abducted by aliens. But it gets worse. Her eyes flicked to her marshmallow blackened in the fire. She pulled it out and blew out the fire, engulfing it. She popped it in her mouth as Gwen took a deep breath to continue the story. Jen hated sharing this part, but either she was feeling more comfortable than normal, or more likely the liquor in her system had her not caring because she continued on her own. See, Vilgax had seen humans before, fought humans, probably killed a few, but he said he'd never had the chance to study a specimen before. At the word specimen, the air around the campfire seemed to grow dim and cold. Yep. Jen popped the P at the end of the word hard. Nobody likes that word, with good reason. Tends to make one think of the clinical. So he got me strung up on his ship and brought out the surgical equipment. No painkillers, though. His drones were prepping the ship for takeoff, so he had all the time in the world to slice me open. She paused, skewering another marshmallow. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the slight splash of the nearby water. I don't remember much after that. Next thing I knew, Gwen was there with the rust bucket, and the cut was gone. Grandpa was trying to get me down, but the ship was malfunctioning. Sent a bolt of power through the watch, made it malfunction too. Turned out to be a good thing, though, when Vilgax came swinging a sword at my arm. He wanted to have the watch, even if he lost his ship. The watch turned me into Diamond Head at the last second, so instead of losing my hand, I ended up with these scars. She pointed at the one on her side, then the one barely an inch from the Omnitrix itself. Manny let out a low whistle.
Damn, that's intense.
Helen rolled her eyes. Jen stood. She trailed off and walked away, slightly unsteady on her feet. Kevin leaned over to Gwen.
Your cousin is an intense drunk.
Gwen rolled her eyes. She looked after her cousin, who'd perched herself on the rock she jumped off of earlier. Pierce frowned.
How'd you manage to save her?
Gwen shrugged. Like she said, Mount Rushmore was a plumber base. It's not currently active, but still had a lot of equipment there. Grandpa gave me something from the medical department. He figured Vilgax wouldn't be too happy that someone else got the watch first. She took the bottle from Kevin and took a swig, grimacing at the burn. But it did little to dull the image of her cousin hanging by her wrists from energy manacles, bloody and barely breathing. They had been nearly too late to save her that day, and it had always stuck with Gwen. She looked back up at her cousin and was surprised to see that Ethan had snuck away from the group and was sitting with her. She was sprawled out on the rock, her head in his lap, one arm pointing up at the stars, and she seemed to be telling him something amusing because he was holding back laughter. Gwen smiled.